On 7 o'clock, so I'm going to kick this off very, very shortly. I'm just going to give it a few seconds in case there's one or two more people just coming in, so just bear with me for a very short time. Okay, well, very, very warm welcome to everybody who's connected into this. There's 33 participants showing at the moment. It's quite possible one or two more will join us just a few minutes late, but I'm anxious that we start on time. Before I go any further, let me introduce myself first. So my name is Andrew Thynne. I'm currently chairman of the Scottish Land Commission, and I'm speaking to you from just outside Inverness. And before we go any further, there are three other people on the panel, if you like, the people who will be discussing things with you. So I'd like them to introduce themselves before I go any further. So Emma, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi everyone, lovely to see you all this evening. I'm Emma Cooper and I'm the head of land rights and responsibilities for the Scottish Land Commission. So I'm part of the senior management team, and my job is about ensuring that the Scottish Government's land rights and responsibilities statement, about which you're going to hear in the presentation, is implemented in practice. I'm based just outside of Inverness, having moved over here from Bute fairly recently.
Emma, thank you very much indeed. And David, right down at the other end of the country, almost. David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, good to see everyone tonight. I'm David Adams. I'm one of the 5 commissioners, Scottish Land Commissioners. We are very much sort of a part-time oversight role, but we do have an excellent staff, including Emma, up at Inverness. I'm based in the Scottish Borders. I'm actually also Emeritus Professor of Urban Studies at the University of Glasgow, where until recently I was on the full-time staff. And you can guess from perhaps that title that my interest is primarily in urban land, although obviously I follow very closely all the work of the Commission.
David, thank you very much. And we now head west to Lorne. Lorne, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hello everybody, my name's Lorne MacLeod. I'm one of the land commissioners. I'm based in Oban. My background prior to being a land commissioner was that I was the chair of Community Land Scotland, which is the representative body for community landowners in Scotland, and I was 6 years on the board of the buyout group for the islands of Eriskay, South Uist and Benbecula, and prior to that 6 years involved on the board of the Isle of Gia Heritage Trust. So I've had a land reform background over the last 25 years and looking forward to hearing the discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorne. So there's 4 of us here for you this evening, myself, 2 commissioners, 2 board members and 1 senior member of staff. These public meetings became quite early on a kind of signature, part of the signature of the Land Commission, and for our first 2 or 3 years, we held public meetings in village halls all over the country, at least once a month. And it was very, very important, I think, in shaping the early work programs, the priorities, and so on. Of course, COVID has put paid to that, but we're not going to give up. So we've switched to doing it online, self-evidently. It's not quite the same. I have to say, I really miss the village halls, and I really miss the private conversations in the margin of those public meetings, which we can't so easily do by this format, but we will do our best. It's just after 7 o'clock now. We will finish no later than 8:30. Before that, if we've run out of things to talk about. We've got 37 people now on the meeting. Also with us, but in the background, I should just mention are Jess and Sarah, and they are managing the technology and keeping the thing running. So this should run pretty smoothly. We've done it now a number of times. The purpose of these meetings is to have a conversation with you. It's not to give you a lecture or tell you things so much as have a conversation. And that's what we want to do. So the format will be, Lauren's going to give a very brief sort of scene setting presentation. I think that's helpful because not everyone is equally familiar with what we do and what we're trying to do. So Lauren will set the scene. But after that, and for the remainder of the time, it is a conversation and we'll use the chat function. So normally, obviously, in a public meeting, people raise their hands and we have a much more interactive conversation. It's more difficult here, but if we use the chat function, if you put into the chat function what you want to say, your thoughts, your comments, or your questions, then we will work our way through and I will endeavour to ensure that we address everything that's raised there. I think that's probably enough by way of an introduction. And Lauren, if you are ready, I'm just going to hand it over to Lauren now to set the scene. So over to you, Lauren.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I think this will be a bit of a whistle-stop tour through all the work that we have been involved with over the last 3 years and also looking forward to the next 3 years. But I do think it's quite useful in just setting the context before we move on to our question and discussion. So first of all, what is land reform? Well, land reform is defined as a process of change to laws, regulations and customs regarding land ownership and use. And it really is central to the big public policy challenges at the moment of climate change and also post-COVID recovery. Why does it matter? Well, the situation is Scotland has one of the most concentrated land ownership patterns in the world. 50% of Scotland's privately owned rural land is in the hands of just over 400 owners. That's just 0.008% of Scotland's population total. How land is owned and used and who benefits from those arrangements is important to economic and community development being undertaken in a socially just way. The Scottish Land Commission was established in 2017, and this followed the passing of the Land Reform Act 2016. There are 5 land commissioners and 1 tenant farming commissioner, supported by a small team of core staff. Our role is to stimulate fresh thinking and change in how Scotland owns and uses land, and to advise the Scottish Government and others on an ongoing programme of land reform. As well as providing advice and recommendations for law and policy reform, we provide leadership for change in culture and behaviour on the ground. So it's not all about law and legal changes, it's about changing behaviour on the ground as we move forward. Much of our work is underpinned by Scotland's Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, and this statement was one of the outcomes of the Land Reform Act 2016, and is the first of its kind in the world in terms of setting out the relationship between land reform and human rights, recognising that along with rights to own land come responsibilities to your neighbours, to your community, and the wider public good. Property rights used to be perceived as a barrier to land reform, but Scotland is now moving in line with the rest of the world in recognising that human rights can actually be a springboard for progressing land reform, and that land reform itself can help fulfil our human rights obligations. Now, moving on to this slide, this is really to give you a flavour of the work that we have undertaken since we were established 3 years ago, before I move on to talk about the current work that we're going to undertake. So taking from the top there, concentration of land ownership, we published proposals back in 2019 to address the impact of Scotland's highly concentrated pattern of private land ownership, including a proposal for a public interest test for land ownership of scale. And we shall be publishing more details on these proposals in the next few weeks. Vacant and derelict land, it's been really a major focus over the last 3 years, and there remains 11,000 hectares of these sites across Scotland. That's roughly equivalent to twice the size of the city of Dundee, causing a significant blight on local communities and missed opportunities of not using that land more productively. Together with the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, we established the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force, which has brought national attention to the issue, and we have published recommendations to bring back land into productive use. Land value sharing, we have advised the government on how the uplift value of land created by public investments, for example, improvements in infrastructure or planning permission, could be more effectively shared between private developers and society. Land for housing, we've also undertaken a wide-ranging review of how land is being made available for housing and for development projects. This started at the end of 2019, recognizing that we needed a fundamental change in how land is made available for housing if we want to create places that people want to live in at prices they can afford. We will report on the results of this work to ministers in this year. The Good Practice Programme, and I'm delighted Emma is here tonight, she can talk more about it later. All of our work is underpinned by the government's Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. So we've invested a lot of time to develop guidance and protocols, as well as working with different types of landowners and communities around what changes are needed in practice on the ground. We've published some 7 protocols so far. We have published advice to government on regional land use partnerships, which build on the land use strategy and the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. And finally, and by no means least, is the work of our Tenant Farming Commissioner, whose role is to improve relations between tenant farmers and landowners. And he has published 7 codes of practice and a range of guidance, and I'll give more details on his role later in this presentation. So now moving on to our priorities for work in the next 3 years. You'll see there the 3 topics: strategic objectives, reforming land rights, responsible land ownership and use, and reforming land markets. Firstly, looking at reforming land rights. This work will contribute in particular to Scotland's ambitions for repopulating rural areas, ensuring land is more easily available for housing and infrastructure, increasing community ownership of land and buildings, and community wealth building and supporting our wider economic recovery and renewal. Within this work stream, we shall be looking at how we can have more diverse land ownership, and we shall also be identifying new governance models for owning land, possible hybrid governance models, mixing private and public, and also managing our common good land. The second work stream is responsible land ownership and use, with the aim of making sure that whoever owns or uses land are doing it in a way which is more responsible and accountable to local communities and the public benefit. So in our new strategic plan, we shall continue to invest a lot of resources in helping landowners of all types and local communities adopt and implement the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. We are also going to be looking at how the statement could be mainstreamed within local authorities, public agencies, and the private sector. And our work will also involve advising the government on the land use strategy and guidance on community engagement and land use decision making. The work of the Tenant Farming Commissioner is also, of course, focused on responsible land ownership and use, and I'm going to speak a bit more about that later. Our third and final work stream is reforming land markets, and we see land values as being critical for many of the issues that land reform aims to deal with. For example, how land is used productively and how more people can benefit from owning or using land. Now, land values have increased more than 450% since 1995, They are now valued across the whole of the United Kingdom at approximately £5 trillion. This has led many people to question how the benefits from increasing land values are distributed and whether more needs to be done to ensure that the gains from rising land values benefit society as a whole. Part of the answer to how we derive greater public benefit from changing land values are tax and fiscal frameworks. And we have set up a tax advisory group, which I chair, to work with us in looking in greater depth at tax reforms in relation to land. And we're also looking at more practical options for reforming land markets to enable land to better deliver public benefits. The final few minutes of this presentation will focus on the work of the Tenant Farming Commissioner, who is Bob McIntosh. And the role of the Tenant Farming Commissioner was created following the 2016 Land Reform Act, and the role is to encourage and promote good relations between farming tenants and landlords. Now, 7 codes of practice have been issued so far on subjects such as conducting rent reviews, sporting rights, and agreeing and managing agricultural leases. Where an interested party formally reports an alleged breach of a published code of practice, the Tenant Farming Commissioner will investigate this breach and has the ultimate power to impose a penalty for failure to comply. However, it has been seen that most issues have been resolved through amicable discussion and agreement, and the Tenant Farming Commissioner has promoted mediation as a route to avoid legal proceedings where possible. Another important role of the Tenant Farming Commissioner is to support new entrants into farming through such initiatives as the Land Matching Service and encouraging succession planning. So as I said, this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour through all that we are involved with as the Scottish Land Commission. I'm now happy to pass back to Andrew to open up for questions and discussion. Thank you for listening.
Lauren, thank you very much indeed. That was admirably concise and a summary. So before I go any further, can I just welcome the people who have joined since the start. We're now up to 40. We're a very small public body. In essence, our job is to provide advice to government, to Parliament, but more widely as well, as you heard from Lauren, with protocols, codes of practice, and all the rest of it. I've got 2 questions actually that have been emailed in at the start. So I'm just going to pick those up while you're thinking about what you might want to say. Can I just emphasize, though, this is a conversation. We want to hear from you, not just questions, but thoughts, observations, challenges. We're public servants. We're here to be held to account. I believe very strongly that public servants should be held to account, which is why we hold public meetings every month. So please use the chat button and participate. I'll just pick the 2 that have been emailed in first, and we'll maybe try and deal with those. So the first of those is from Jane Brewster, and it's actually raising an issue that's not directly impacting on our work, but it raises some really interesting issues. The question is, how can the Land Commission ensure that many promises of superfast broadband to rural areas can actually be fulfilled in 2021? And as someone who lives a short cycle from Inverness, and the broadband is so bad that I have to use a satellite, I have some sympathy with that. Now, clearly, land reform and access to superfast broadband are, the linkage between those 2 is slightly tenuous, but there are some real issues. Emma, do you just want to touch just a few quick thoughts, because you have a background in this from before you joined us, so I think it'd be helpful if you could just touch on it.
Yeah, sure. In my previous role, I did a fair bit of advocacy really on behalf of rural communities about rural broadband. So whilst, as Andrew said, it's not really within our remit to deal with it, we do know that it's an extremely important issue, and we've done some work on rural housing provision and the needs of communities in general, in rural areas in particular, and how those needs can be met. And that's been quite helpful for us in getting a clear picture on that and what needs to happen to improve that situation, of which broadband is absolutely a part of that. You can get more information on that from Digital Scotland. The website is scotlandsuperfast.com. But I'll leave it there, Andrew, if that's okay.
Brilliant, thanks, Emma. I'm sure we'll talk further about the work on housing, but we've done a huge amount of work on the issue of access to land for housing, and it's a big challenge in rural Scotland. And clearly, as we build more housing and as employment hopefully moves out from the urban settlements post-COVID, then making sure that people can then connect into their work is going to be even more important. So I think government knows that. The other question that was emailed in, I've got one on the chat as well from Hamish Gregg. Thanks, Hamish. I'll come to that in a wee second. So the other one that was emailed in was from Lynn Devine. Lynn, thank you very much indeed, which was asking about the work on, sorry, I'm just finding the text, about our work on common good land. So we've done some quite important work, I think, on common good land, and may well do more. But the question is very specific, and I'll just read it. Since the Inner Court judgment regarding properties built on common good land becoming common good properties, could you tell me the impact this is having across the country? And I don't think we can answer the specifics, because it's really, A, it's too early, and B, it's the local authorities, and particularly COSLA, that can answer that rather than us. We're not close enough to it. But I think it would be really helpful to tell you a wee bit more about the work we've already done on common good land, because it is important. And government quite early on actually asked us to do some work on this, and asked us to review whether changes to common good legislation might be helpful in improving or increasing the community value of common good properties. It's a bit unfair, but I'm going to ask you to start, and then we'll see if the others want to say anything. Just thoughts in general on what we're trying to do with common good land.
Yeah, so we did a review of common good land, and we are expecting to make further recommendations for legislative changes later this year, thinking about the governance arrangements for common good land in particular. I know the case that Lynn's referring to, so thanks for that. And I know that local authorities are considering it. One of the cases we've had recently has been related to that, actually. And I'll happily tell you about that in a bit more detail if you want to have a chat outside of this. We published a protocol just in December on common good land, and we consulted with all of the local authorities on that. Some of them, you know, have a common good officer, and it's quite easy to get that engagement. Some of them don't have a common good officer, and it makes it more challenging to get that engagement. 13 local authorities provided input into that protocol and agreed it. And all local authorities have to pay attention to the recommendations that the Scottish Land Commission is making on common good. So that recommends some key changes around transparency of information and engagement with communities and collaborative decision making about common good. And I'm quite looking forward really to seeing how that work develops over the coming months this year, and happy to point you into, in fact, my colleagues put the link in the chat about common good, where you can see a bit more information about the work that we've been doing.
Brilliant, thanks, Emma. I'm just going to go to the questions now, but I think Kerr Roger is trying to raise his hand. Kerr, can you type your question or your thoughts into the chat box, please? And I'll get to you at that point. I need to just take people in order, if that's okay. So Hamish Gregg has raised a question, which I think is a really interesting question, and I'm going to go to Lauren first with it. The question is, how does the Commission fit with community empowerment and community asset transfer processes, especially where communities seek to use buildings and land the owner wishes to dispose of? Now, lots and lots of things happening in that sort of area. Lauren, why don't you kick off with some thoughts on that, its relationship to our work and also its wider significance? And then David, because you've also got direct experience, I'm going to come to you too. Lauren first.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Hamish. The question asking how does the Commission fit in with the community empowerment, community asset transfer process? Well, obviously we were created in 2017, which is after the 2015 Community Empowerment Act, but absolutely we very much endorse all that is included within that in moving forward with the land reform. The community asset transfer process is something that we are seeing increasingly being used, and for the benefit of the wider audience here, it allows communities that are properly formed into groupings can make a request to a local authority or a public agency or indeed the Scottish Government where they feel an asset, a land or building can be better used in the hands of that community, and there is a process involved and communities can come forward with a proposal and then it is judged on its merits. Now all public bodies should really have on their website or available to the public a list of all the assets that they actually own, and also have a process in place where a community can come forward with a request. So we very much work in Dove, in support of all that has been going on, but we're not at a stage where we've actually reviewed it because it's so early, but that may come in future in terms of evaluating how it's going, pluses and minuses, and it would be good to hear some feedback from communities that have gone through that. But I'll maybe just stop there and pass back to Andrew if there's comments from other commissioner staff.
Lauren, thank you. David, you've had some direct experience of this. Do you want to just outline your thoughts?
Yeah, very, very important issue. That what we have is a whole program of work on community ownership. So we see asset transfer as part of that work. And on our website is a very detailed report, I think probably about a couple of years ago, on what was working well and was not working well in terms of community ownership. So that was sort of the evidence base, the investigation. And what we then did was to prepare a series of recommendations and publish those. So the recommendations have gone to the Scottish ministers, and that's our job. So the two, I mean, there's a whole series of recommendations about community land ownership, but the two I think that are most relevant to this discussion are the first one, which is recommending that there should be proactive consideration of community land and asset ownership within the local place planning process. In other words, that local authorities should use the planning system to identify at an early stage proactively what assets they think might be suitable for transfer. And then we also made more detailed recommendations, and there were a whole series of detailed recommendations, but they were encapsulated in the summary, which was that local authorities should adopt a more proactive and strategic approach to the transfer of public owned land. Now, I'm not going to go into all those details now because we haven't a lot of time, but either if you want, the staff can point you those out, or they're available on the website. But we have, as I say, made very specific recommendations to the Scottish Government on how to improve the asset transfer process.
David, thank you very much indeed. So we may well come back to the question of community ownership, but I want to keep moving because a lot of people are putting things in through the chat and I don't want to miss anybody out. No question that community empowerment and the asset transfer processes have already been pretty powerful. Now, question from Mr. Monroe, which I think is a really important question. Might you be able to expand on the concept of protocols and their basis in law? It worries me they seem to be worked out by an appointed committee and then imposed without parliamentary debate or scrutiny. As an example, the term penalties were just outlined by Lorne when described Bob McIntosh's work. So let me just start, and then I'm going to come to Emma, because there is a difference between the protocols and what Bob McIntosh is doing. So the 2016 legislation, the Land Reform Act, established the position of a tenant farming commissioner and established a requirement that the Tenant Farming Commissioner published codes of practice. They weren't called protocols, they're codes of practice. So what Lauren was talking about was Bob's codes of practice. And there is a process outlined in law where you can allege a breach of the code of practice. Bob can call for evidence and come to a decision about whether that breach has happened or not. And the penalties that was referred to is Bob's right to levy penalties if you decline to provide evidence. He doesn't have a legal right to fine anybody. And that, some people think that's right, some people think it's wrong. But clearly, if he was going to have the power to fine people in some way, then absolutely the question about scrutiny, appeal routes and law and all the rest of it kicks in. The protocols are very different. They're guidance, and I'm going to pass to Emma. Not so much to talk about what we've done, but just the principle of the protocols and what are we trying to achieve through them as a generality. Emma, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So the protocols, and we have 8 of them at the moment, cover things like diversifying ownership of land, community engagement in decisions around land, and good stewardship of land, issues along those lines. And really they are recommendations or expectations for how people should behave. They are not enforceable in any way. They're entirely voluntary. But the aim of them really was to put together something which made it easier for people to understand what it is that we were expecting of them. And they're relatively new, really. The community engagement one's been around for a while, and there's a lot of supporting information with that. And we know that that's been well used by a lot of organisations to improve the community engagement in decisions around land. And the other ones are a bit newer. So we're still learning from those and testing them out, really. Now, we did agree them with a number of stakeholders. So, for example, Scottish Land and Estates, the National Farmers Union Scotland, Community Land Scotland, organisations like that were involved in developing the protocols and have agreed them. And they did that in consultation with their membership or based on their expertise of the issues on the ground. So we hope that they are proportional, and the feedback so far has been quite positive about them. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Emma. But to emphasise, they are guidance. So the point being raised there, which is, I think, a really important point. But I'm sorry, I don't know what the E stands for. It says Mr. E. Monroe, but whatever the E stands for, the point being raised by Mr. Monroe is absolutely valid. That we do not, in this country, go down a road where there isn't full accountability when you're exercising authority like that. And it is a pretty basic principle. There needs to be rights of appeal. These protocols are not requirements. There are no penalties associated with the protocols. They are guidance. Thank you for raising that. That's appreciated. The next one from John Duffy. John, so what is the state of play with respect to compulsory sale orders in respect of vacant and derelict land? Question mark. Legislation soon? Question mark. So compulsory sale orders was an idea set out in the current administration's manifesto. We were asked to investigate how it might work in practice. We did very, very early on. We stepped on the gas and moved very quickly and published a pretty detailed set of proposals. They have not come through in law, and I don't think they will in the current Parliament, because circumstances have conspired. As you can see, Parliament's always struggled to get everything through, even without COVID. So it's not likely to happen in the current Parliament, and I don't know what's going to be in anyone's manifesto for the next Parliament, so I don't know what will happen there. But let me just ask David to say perhaps 1 or 2 more words on the whole idea of compulsory sale orders. David, because I know this is something you've thought about a lot. You're muted, David.
Okay, can you hear me now, Andrew?
Yeah, I got you. Thanks, David.
Sorry about that. So, yeah, I think it's just worthwhile for the audience as a whole just to run over what we're saying and then move on to where we are with it. What the Commission did was pick up the idea that people should not be able to hold on indefinitely on land that's vacant or derelict and prevent other people from making use of it. And then comes a time, however long that's defined, where if land has been kept unused and vacant and nothing's happening, then we recommended local authorities should be given the power to require that the land be sold and sold by public auction. And there will be a whole series of safeguards to make sure that whoever bought it was going to put it to use. Now, all that sounds slightly complex, but it is. What the Commission did is it took a very broad idea and has actually put a lot of detailed work into how it could be made to work. So I'm not going to go into those details now. The issue being that there had been manifesto commitments at the past election that it would be implemented, and those manifesto commitments included that of the current government. What's happened is that the legislative programme and actually all the lawyers who might have drafted legislation got diverted into Brexit legislation and secondary legislation for Brexit, and the government came to the conclusion that it didn't have the resources or the time to deal with the matter in the current Parliament. Having said that, the Minister has made a very clear commitment that it would be a priority for the next Parliament, obviously, if that Minister is still in post or in power. And I think the key thing now is to wait and see whether other political parties in their manifestos pick up the idea and also commit themselves to legislation and hopefully early legislation. So I think the summary is, yes, it's been delayed. The reasons given are around a legislative backlog, and the Commission would hope that the powers will be brought into legislation early in the next Parliament.
David, thank you very much. And John, thanks for raising that. And just for those who don't know what a compulsory sale order is, in a nutshell, and please forgive me if this is too much of a nutshell, but the essence of it was that where land is vacant and derelict, local authorities should have the power to require the sale of that land by auction in the expectation that it would then be bought and used, because you're unlikely to buy it if you're not going to use it. So it's a bit like a compulsory purchase order where the local authority has the power to purchase something, but it gives the local authority, or would give the local authority, the power to require that land to be sold at auction. And potentially helpful because there's some evidence that some of these sites are being sat on because the owner thinks they're more valuable than the market thinks, and requiring an auction would settle that. Big subject. There's quite a detailed report on our website if you want to see it. Let's move on. Norman Cunningham. Norman, thank you. How does the Land Commission sit with disputed proposed use for vacant land when seller stipulates the future use of the land? Now, I'm not 100% sure that any of us is going to be sufficiently legally competent to answer this question, but I'm going to pass to David and let him try. David.
I'm just wondering whether Norman could, through the chat function, just give us an example of what this might mean, and we could pick it up as soon as we've got that in, because I don't want to answer the question without properly understanding it, and whether, if Norman could do that, we could come back to it, Andrew.
Okay, we'll come back to this question. Norman, could you type in a bit more? While we're on that subject, Elspeth Coates has put in a long question, but there's a couple of abbreviations. Would you mind just elaborating the abbreviations? So you put, I'm involved in a CATS project, and then down at the bottom, I think AT is a good place to develop this. Sorry, AT for me is Andrew Thin. So if you wouldn't mind just elaborating these initials, it's just helpful for everybody, I think, in this. Right, we'll come back to Norman's question in a wee second. Hopefully you're still on the system, Norman. John Duffy again, let's, wait, there's something just come in. Asset transfer, right, I've got it. Okay, thanks, Elspeth. let's go to John Duffy's other question, please. Will the Land Commission be introducing best practice or guidelines as to how the new 50 million programme for remediation of vacant and derelict land should operate? Now, I don't think we've been asked to do that, and it's a government programme, it's not our programme, and therefore the short answer is that as things stand, we've no plans to do so because we haven't been asked to provide guidelines on somebody else's fund. But that doesn't mean we wouldn't be willing to. Emma, if we were asked to, what's the answer?
Oh, right. That's not what I was going to answer.
No, it's all right. I'm just
okay.
Just teasing.
So yes, so we had a project. It was mentioned in the presentation with SEPA, Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and it was the Vacant Derelict Land Task Force, and they made a number of recommendations for things that needed to help us tackle vacant derelict land. Now, I was just going to touch on why it was such an issue for Scotland. And that's basically because there is an awful lot of it, and the amount of it hasn't really changed over, I think it's like 1990 or something. It's a really long period of time, and the majority of it, or there is a bias towards where vacant and derelict land is, and it tends to be in lower income communities. So that there's some issues there around equality and fairness that form part of that. Now, there are a few things that we've identified through the research that kind of block us to vacant and derelict land being tackled, and some of those are in the recommendations that we've formed. So I know that there are some ongoing conversations about those recommendations between the Commission and government, but to what extent we're going to be invited to shape up those guidelines, I'm not yet sure. Shona would be able to answer much better, my colleague, and I'd be very happy to put somebody, John, in touch with her or somebody else to talk a bit more about that. We've definitely had absolutely loads of inquiries about it since the report was published, which is fantastic and really helpful to understand those kind of on the ground situations for us.
Thank you very much, Emma. It is a really big subject, the whole vacant and derelict thing. And there's an awful lot of stuff on our website. So we may come back to this evening, but I think given the number of questions that are coming in, I'm going to move us on. Now, Norman, thank you. Norman, thanks for adding the comment in there. So the seller, which in this particular instance, this is the example he's giving, is selling land for private housing development, and the community wants and needs social housing and community enterprises. Now we have a STUSI. Can the seller stipulate what the land is used for? Now, that's normally a planning matter, and the local authority will also be the planning authority. So normally the amount of social housing and other aspects of community infrastructure are dealt with through planning. But I'm going to come to David and then to Emma to offer any thoughts on that, please. David first.
I think this is a common issue, actually, and I don't think there's necessarily an easy answer to it, but there's a huge amount of evidence that councils and other public bodies do exactly this, which they are attempting to sell their land for the highest possible financial value they can get, obviously because of all the other financial problems they have, and are not necessarily, and I'm talking in general terms, balancing that with other less valuable but socially beneficial uses. Now, all I can say is what the Land Commission have done, because I can't say that it's a problem that is easily resolved, because it's a much broader issue than the Land Commission. But what we are doing is trying to, and this ties up, Lorne in his presentation talked about land valuations and approaching land valuations in different ways. And actually that's pretty central to the question being asked here. And what we have done is we have commissioned and published research on assessing benefits from land in a much broader way than, should we say, simply straight financial benefits. And I think all we can do and all we have done is to try and initiate and prompt that debate so that the benefits of uses that bring help the community and help society, but may not necessarily be the most financially lucrative of uses, that there is a method for evaluating them that perhaps makes councils and others think twice before simply selling off land for just the highest financial value. Having said that, this is an issue that has been around 20, 30, 40 years, and it's not one that will easily go away. But I think if we can sort of show that there are different approaches to identifying value and identifying benefits, we can start a conversation that hopefully will go a lot further. Thanks.
David, thanks. It is a very difficult issue. Emma, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just we're aware of some issues that people have had with title burdens or clawback arrangements on land, and that's where a condition is placed on the land, and sometimes that can have a really adverse effect on the viability of what the land's used for in the future. So it is recommended in our protocols that where those arrangements are used, that they are they should be kind of proportionate, and we should avoid using those that can have an adverse impact on the viability or sustainability of businesses, community projects, or other activities that take place on the land. I'm not sure if that's helpful, but again, Norman, do feel free to get in touch if you want to discuss a specific case. We do that quite often and always open to doing so.
Great, Norman, thanks. It is a really difficult issue. And as David says, one has to feel for local authorities. It's often frustrating, but local authorities are and certainly are going to be phenomenally short of funds and money. And the temptation to sell to the highest bidder is always going to be there. And the more you stipulate the future use, the chances are the less money you'll get. So it's a tricky one for them. But if you've got specifics that you want to discuss, please take up Emma's offer. I'll explain at the end of the meeting how to contact us, and we'd really welcome that. Thank you. The next one from David Dykes. David, thank you. Is an assertion, or really rather than a question, but just it's worth picking it up. Derelict land, there seem to be many complicated regulations applicable to derelict buildings and land. There seem to be lots of such land to the extent that it's almost impossible to gain access to the land. So I'm not quite sure if there seemed to be a contradiction in the last sentence, but there is no doubt that vacant and derelict land generally is vacant and derelict for a reason. It may be contaminated or whatever. So it's not a simple matter, which is why we spent best part of 2 years really drilling into this pretty thoroughly. David, without taking a lot of time, because there's a lot of questions coming in and thoughts coming in, do you want to just summarize the sort of key issues that need to happen to try and tackle the particularly the big pieces of derelict land that are blighting urban Scotland? I think particularly if you could tackle that. You're muted, David. You're muted, David.
Sorry again. It's absolutely right. There's an awful lot of this land, and actually the total acres hasn't changed a great deal over many years. So what the Commission has done is a lot of detailed investigation and bringing key parties together in the task force to come up with 4 key recommendations. So I'll just go through these. The first one is about actually knowing where this land is, because the data is actually pretty obscure and pretty hidden. And the first recommendation is making sure that's open, transparent, and revealed as to where the problematic sites are that have potential. The second set of recommendations is about a joined up approach and getting all the different public authorities and private agencies to work together in prioritising the sites. The third key thing is about demonstrating effective delivery, effective change, making the changes that are needed on a site basis to tackle these. And then equally important, I think this might relate to the question, is embedding a socially responsible approach to land reuse, because actually the stock of vacant and derelict land is a bit like a bath, where some's going out of the bottom when you pull out the plug, but at the same time the taps are on, and you think you're solving the problem by bringing land back into use, but actually more vacant and derelict land is being created. So that fourth recommendation is about people thinking very carefully so as not to actually create more vacant and derelict land in the future. And I think the £50 million we were talking about is in response and in recognition to the importance of the subject as shown in the task force. Now, whether the specifics that you mentioned will be dealt with in future, I don't know, but I think what the Commission has done is to really raise this issue up the policy profile, get a lot of key people, including ministers, understanding the importance of tackling it and getting a much stronger commitment going ahead than we've had in the past. So hopefully, if we were here in 5 years' time, we will be able to see some progress and the amount falling and land being brought back into use and not continuing to increase, which has been the problem. Thanks, Andrew.
David, thank you. A lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to have to gallop on. The next one's for Lorne, I think. A long question from Elsa Coates. I'm not going to read it all, but really making the point that it can be very challenging for communities to take on the ownership of assets, whether through asset transfer or through any other route, actually. Of course, it is equally the case that public money is going to be extraordinarily scarce over the next decade or so, post-COVID. So this is going to be tough. There's a hint at the, I quite understand the last sentence in this question, but it's there's no question that volunteering is going to become more important. No question that trying to get private money through charitable foundations and so on into this sector is going to be hugely important. Lorne, we've done an awful lot of work around, how do we help to continue to, not just to continue the very successful trend of community ownership, but also to accelerate it if we can and bring it more into urban Scotland and so on. Do you want to just offer some general thoughts to Elspeth?
Yeah, and I'll also maybe take the next question as well as from Hamish, and is also referring to the Community Asset Transfer Scheme, just so that we can cover both here, and that allows other people's questions to be addressed afterwards. So I'm picking up from Elspeth's note there, maybe a wee bit of frustration, a great deal of voluntary time that has to go towards putting forward a community asset transfer proposal, and I think that this one also refers to forestry. Now, I know a community group on the island of Raasay that I think was the first to go through the new Forestry and Land Scotland community and asset transfer process, and they've now actually acquired some land which they're going to do 2 hydroelectric projects, community owned, and they're now undertaking a £600,000 community share issue to take that forward to fruition. They've also got some grant support, but yeah, I can just imagine the huge voluntary effort for a community group to take forward a proposal such as that. I'm sorry, Elspeth, I don't know about the specific one that you're referring to there, but I think it's a very general question about the amount of community effort needed to take things forward. Now, I would certainly flag up, and have had flagged up to me from many other community groups, just the sheer amount of time that is taken up in going forward. And perhaps at some later date, the Scottish Government might ask us to review the asset transfer process that came on the back of the Community Empowerment Act there, just to see what are the issues. Because as we move around the public meetings, we get various concerns that are raised to us, particularly also from communities whose proposal for community asset transfer has been turned down, and they are quite aggrieved at the reasons that have been given. So I think this is very much a new process. It only came in particularly after the 2015 Act, and there's maybe a bit of bedding down to do. But I think we as the Land Commission need to kind of pick up some of this feedback and perhaps you know, through our protocols, and I know we have a protocol about community ownership of land and buildings, and I think through that shows best practice, and I think it has a lot of relevance to community asset transfer. So I think there's a lot in there, but I do pick up a sense of frustration in these questions about community asset transfer, and I think, you know, we take these on board, and as I say, maybe address them as much as possible through protocols, and maybe also meeting with public bodies and local authorities and just explaining the process, because I'm picking up there from Hamish's point, just the last one, the legislation rhetoric is fine, but the reality is not. So there's obviously some frustration out there, and I think we take that on board. Thanks, Andrew.
Lauren, thanks very much. And Elspeth has put a further comment in the bottom, which is very helpful. She's saying, what I'm trying to say is that we need livelihoods, not volunteering, as a basis for a sustainable future. That clearly is true. It's true, we need livelihoods, but actually, I think we might slightly disagree that we don't need volunteering. I think we need volunteering too, and the community ownership sector has, you know, an awful lot of the impetus has come from people who have sat on voluntary community companies, and well, Lauren's one of them actually. But what we know is that communities can successfully take on land and then create livelihoods. Lauren, I might just ask you to say a very brief word further using South Uist or wherever as an example, because communities, it's volunteers who get community acquisitions moving, but those acquisitions frequently do create employment and livelihoods, don't they, Lauren? Do you want to say very briefly a bit about that? Well,
again, I've been involved in a lot of the community buyouts of land that have been taken forward by communities over the years there. I'm a chartered accountant to trade. That's my kind of day job, but I'm very much somebody that would advocate that you must have a strong business plan, a good financial plan in going forward with any development such as that. And in my experience, those that community buyouts that have worked best are those that really look at the kind of financial income streams from projects or initiatives going forward in order to sustain the wider role in supporting the community and doing other things. And we were fortunate in South Uist in being able to take forward a 100% community-owned wind farm, which was only actually 3 turbines, but because they were wholly owned, all the income from those 3 turbines, and that's throughout a 93,000 acre estate, were able to generate sufficient income to allow other projects to take forward and allowed to employ individuals, because at the outset of that buyout, you actually start, although it cost 4.5 million or something like that, that money went to the syndicate that owned the estate previously. So the community actually starts with 0 in the bank and then having to go forward with an initiative. So it's absolutely essential to get revenue streams coming in to go forward and to sustain the projects in the longer term. And I think actually has been demonstrated, a lot of the communities have been extremely successful in doing that and actually now undertaking a wider role in society. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Lauren. The next one is going to be for you as well, I think, but I'm just going to, there's a few comments on the way down the screen. So who is the minister who would deal with CSOs? From Lynn Devine. Lynn, thank you. So we report to well, yeah, who do? I'm not sure.
For you? Shall I answer that?
Yes, David. I'm not sure we know for certain who would take a CSO bill through, but
well, the minister who the current minister is Kevin Stewart, who's housing planning, who has made the commitment that the legislation would be ready to go to the Scottish Parliament after elections. So it would be Mr. Stewart, if he remains in his current post, or whoever becomes the housing or planning minister thereafter, is the current situation. I mean, obviously ministerial names might change.
David, thanks. So that's the current situation. I just reiterate what I said before, that we've given advice to government, and well, technically our minister is Rosanna Cunningham, but we've given advice to government. It will be a matter for the incoming administration, whoever that is, to decide what they want to do and which minister handles it. And it might get tagged onto another bill of some sort. That can sometimes happen. So I think we have to wait and see. Now, I want to move down. There are a number of things there I think we've dealt with, because I want to talk about tax, which is a big issue we've made it clear on a number of occasions that we think that taxation has an important role to play in land reform, and we've set up a group, and I'm going to ask Lauren to say a wee bit more about it. The specific question from Ian Kirkwood, thanks Ian, is about land value tax. So you could maybe start with that, Lauren, but we're not just looking at land value tax. We're going to do quite a lot more work on tax more generally, because we do know that both tax levied from Holyrood and tax levied from Westminster has a significant influence. So there's a starter for 10 for you, Lauren.
Okay, thanks Andrew for that, and thanks to Ian for the question there. Land value tax, just for the wider audience benefit, in its purest sense, is a tax on the unimproved value of land. So you can immediately identify a wee bit of an issue there, because so much land has been developed. So to go back to its unimproved value would need a lot of work in terms of valuation. But we have indeed undertaken a major review of land value tax. I think it was undertaken by the University of Reading. A grouping is from there that looked at it in detail, very detailed report on our website, and also a summary document of some of the points that came out of that. We looked at overseas comparisons in countries like Denmark that have looked at land value tax. So we have highlighted to Scottish Government the positives and the various negatives in relation to that. But kind of moving on, because land value tax is certainly not forgotten, if that's maybe slight inference from the question there, we have set up a tax advisory group to look at all the various taxes, the ones that are under the competency of Holyrood and those that are reserved to Westminster that affect land. So our tax advisory group has met once, and it's about to meet on Friday again. But what we're looking at firstly is those taxes that may be looked at in order to help recovery post-COVID. So the kind of things that we have talked about in generality are perhaps the possibility of land and building transaction tax maybe being used as a supplement to address concentrated land ownership. We've looked at the derelict land situation and perhaps some kind of tax in there to, well, in terms of a relief to encourage land to be brought back into productive use, but also in terms of vacant land, maybe to encourage actual productivity on that land as well. So there's a lot within that, but in due course our tax advisory group will be looking at those taxes that are reserved to Westminster as well and making recommendations there, and under that auspices we'll be looking at inheritance tax in terms of business property relief, agricultural property relief. We'll also be looking at capital gains tax, the whole gambit of taxes there, and it's really to try and address our overall objectives as a Scottish Land Commission. And it's not just all about taxes. We're also looking at rates and council tax and non-domestic rates as well, and seeing if there are levers that can be used there to actually incentivise more productive use of land and to perhaps change behaviours. Although we are always cognizant in undertaking this work about unintended consequences. If you change or tweak a tax here, it has ramifications somewhere else. So we have to be very conscious of that. We have undertaken a scoping study of all taxes in relation to land, and that's a very useful study. And maybe my colleagues can actually bring up a link to it in the chat. box there in due course, because I think it's very useful setting the scene of what can be looked at. But at this early stage, we're just gathering the research and evidence, and we'll make recommendations over the summer to the government relating to that. So that's just a basic overview of what we're involved with on tax at the moment.
Lauren, thanks very much indeed. Land value tax has not been removed from our advice. We've published a great deal of work already. It's part of the tax work that's ongoing and the focus of the group that Lauren is chairing, as are all other property taxes and indeed other taxes. For example, income tax can have an influence over whether the landowners let land for agriculture. So it's a complex picture, and we're doing our best to develop advice across the piece. Isabel Davis, thanks, Isabel. Councils might argue that they need the money for maintenance of public services, and that's absolutely right. And I think it is very important that people recognise that if you ask a local authority to sell land at somehow a cheaper price, what you're doing is you're taking money out of public services. There's no two ways about that. And similarly, if you ask a local authority to fund, whatever revenue funds you want supported, again, you're taking that money out of other public services. So thanks, Isabel, for reminding us of that. I do think it's really important, particularly post-COVID, when money is going to
just come in there, please, Andrew.
Yes, go for it.
Can I just come in? I mean, I think we just need to distinguish what is the ambit of the Land Commission and what is the ambit of the local planning authorities. And clearly, decisions over for what use land should be developed is or should be a matter for the planning authorities. Now, what one needs to ensure in all this is that those decisions are being taken for good planning reasons rather than necessarily financial reasons. And the decisions are being taken in local authorities by the planning committee rather than the finance committee. And I think the issue being raised there is one of local government ethics. There's a lot of debate around that. But if, for good planning reasons, having gone through the appropriate community engagement, a local planning authority decides to allocate land for, private housing, that is a democratic decision, providing it's been made and not on an underhand basis. So I don't think, whilst we recognise all that's involved in that, I don't think we should, as a land commission, try and deny the democratic right of local authorities to make the decisions that they feel are in the best interests of their area, even if that runs up against opposition in certain places.
Thanks, David. And in a way, you go straight into Hamish Gregg's question, where and rightly flags that some of these issues are more local than the council area, but the decision may be taken at full council level. And I think that's taking us beyond the remit of the Land Commission, so I'm not going to go there. I would just like to touch on the next question, which is from Bill Duff, which is an observation, but I think it's a useful one. Derelict land's particularly an issue in small towns across Scotland, specifically empty, dilapidated hotels, and he mentions Montrose, and I could offer you the name of Scotland where this is an issue. David, I think possibly there's always a risk, I suppose, that the vacant and derelict land focuses on the big, socially deeply damaging areas of vacant and derelict land in Glasgow and so on. But this is a helpful point, isn't it?
Well, I think so, and I think you go around many towns or parts of cities in Scotland, and the negative impact of buildings that have been allowed to go to rack and ruin goes well beyond the immediate area. So I think there are issues here about the confidence of the local community, the viability of other uses nearby, knock-on effects, and so on and so forth. So this is one of the key reasons for bringing forward the proposal on compulsory sale orders, that actually what's needed with many buildings is to shift them out of their current ownership and shift them into someone who could actually do something about it. And one would be surprised to how much can be done if it's in a different ownership. So the compulsory sale order is really to deal with the small end of the problem rather than large derelict sites. That probably requires major public investment. But I think the evidence is that we could actually make quite an inroad into problematic or locally problematic, derelict, disused, rundown buildings or small rundown sites in Scotland by simply getting a move on from whoever owns them at the moment into the hands of someone who's prepared to do something with them. Thanks.
David, thanks. This is such a huge subject, and I'm conscious that we've got less than 20 minutes left. And so just a very, very brief word also from you, David, on Ian Kirkwood's point. But I mean, he's saying how much derelict land would be classified as such if land banked in the form of car parks was included. Just very briefly, because when we talk about
I did see this question coming up and had a thought about it, and actually had a quick look at the register. The register doesn't actually tell us anything about temporary use. So there's about 11,000 hectares. Now, I suspect the temporary car parks wouldn't make a lot of difference in quantitative terms, because they tend to be on the edge of cities, and in quantitative terms, they probably would not add a great deal in terms of hectares. But the issue being that they are a deterrent to new investment. And let me explain how. That there is actually quite a nice income, particularly in sort of places like Glasgow and Edinburgh, that an owner can get in by letting out their land as a temporary car park without actually doing much work to it. And that provides a baseline figure, which then any further investment has to be measured against and has to produce a substantive increase above it. Now, I'm thinking of a particular site in Glasgow that actually the students who were working for me did a lot of project work on, and that was a temporary car park. It was actually a temporary car park, but planning permission for temporary car parking had been refused. So it was a bit of an illicit temporary car park. And the key to getting something done there was probably to clear out the car parking. And then it would become less of a challenge to get something else to happen, because you wouldn't have been getting the short-term rental from the car parking. So I think in overall quantitative terms, probably not a lot of difference, but in key areas, there is land given over to temporary car parking that could actually be better used for elsewhere if local authorities enforce their regulations. Thanks, Andrew.
David, thanks. I think just because there will be some people probably on this call who are slightly puzzled by the classification point. Could you just briefly say, I mean, people often point out in these public meetings that there's lots of vacant and derelict land that's not classified as vacant and derelict land. And, you know, we had that at a meeting in Stornoway, for example, talking about moorland. Could you just say a little to help people there?
Well, there is a minimum size. So you need to be at least 0.2 hectares to get on the register. I think there are actually sites that are missed off the register because it is dependent on local authorities having the resources to update it every year, and some authorities don't do that. So the register is to some extent out of date. I actually think that we need a more proactive system whereby people in the community can identify sites that should be on the register and are not, and there would be a process by which they could ask for those to be considered, because I'm not convinced that the register actually has all the sites on that should be. I mean, not 95%, but that still leaves quite a number of sites that should be there but are not. And this is the data point that the task force highlighted. Thanks.
Thanks, David. huge subject, difficult to squeeze in this evening. Please visit the website. There's a lot of stuff there that will help you read more about it. We've I think dealt with the land tax, the land value tax point. It's too early to say what we're going to recommend. I don't think Lauren could even begin to guess at that. We've only just set this group up. So I think everything's in the frame. Is that fair, Lauren? But I doubt if you want to offer pointers at the moment about recommendations. No, too early. Okay. The next point from Hamish Gregg, Hamish, thanks, is I'd quite like to broaden this one and take it to Emma, if I may. We've only got just under 15 minutes, Emma, so fairly brief. But the point being made here that when communities take on land, they can be extraordinarily productive in a very diverse way. And Lauren, you might want to say something too, Lauren, from your experience. But Emma, do you want to just offer some thoughts on that and how important it can sometimes be?
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of examples where communities have taken ownership of land and absolutely transformed their community as a result of being able to provide what the community needs for itself. So I think it could be really transformative for communities, whether that's a specific asset, a building, or whether it's land. And for us at the Commission, there's something really powerful about partnership and people working collaboratively together to work out what it is that communities need and then working out the best ways in which they can be delivered. So one of the things that we're keen to see a bit more of is a more kind of proactive identification of where there are community ownership or lease or management opportunities that will help the community realise their aspirations.
Lauren, I mean, you've seen a lot of community acquisitions over the years, and you've seen the effect it's had on not just the economy. You know, your wind farm example was a good one, but just on people and confidence and so on. Do you want to say a bit about that?
I think that's right, Andrew. I think there's also been in the past a very much a focus on land, big buyouts, perhaps mostly in the Highlands and Islands there, where there are huge estates. But I think what we're seeing nowadays are a lot more communities that are looking at a parcel of land on the periphery of a village or a town in order to have a development such as some housing, such as some community recreation ground, or to create business workshop units for rent to develop the local economy. So I think that's most interesting, and there is now a greater interest from out with the Highlands and Islands. You've got indeed in the east coast of Scotland, also borders, Dumfries and Galloway. So I think that's positive. And I'll also make a reference to the fact that we've discussed here a lot about the community asset transfer scheme, which is where a community can ask a public body about the acquisition of some land or buildings. But I think it's useful to also flag up that Scottish Land and Estates, which is a representative group of many of the private landowners in Scotland, and Community Land Scotland reached a protocol, which is an agreement that if a community was wishing to come forward to purchase land from a private landowner, there is a step-by-step approach that you can follow. And I think that is indeed referenced in our own protocol on diversification of ownership or acquisition of land there. So don't think the horizon is all about acquisition of land that is currently in public land ownership. I think a community should look wider about acquisition of land that is currently in private land ownership. And as I said at the outset, it's not all about purchasing large estates. It might be just some land on the periphery of a town or a village. Thanks, Andrew.
Lauren, thank you. There's a question coming which is really very important, so I want to move quickly to that. But just before I do that, question from Councillor Darno: do we have problems accessing the land register? Well, just briefly on that, I don't think we have any more problems than anybody else with the land register. It is taking time to get everything fully up to date and so on, and there are obviously resource constraints, and there's been trouble through COVID, but it is getting resolved. So I don't think that's a significant problem. The question I want to move on to is from Mr. Monroe again. Thanks very much for this one, which is about the regional land use partnerships. Now, just to be clear, because I think there was a misunderstanding at the NFU conference, we were asked to do some work as to how these things, if they are introduced, might work. So we sat down with the NFUS, with Scottish Lands and Estates, and with a number of other interested bodies, and developed a report which everyone was agreed to. So it is not correct to say that things, sorry, I can't read the whole thing out here, but it's not correct to say that something hadn't been considered until the last minute. There was long discussions about all of this. I emphasize, we are not, this is advice that we were asked to give the government, and we gave the advice to the government. It's a matter for the government what happens. Of course, if it's going to be introduced, there'll be wide-scale consultation and all the rest of it. I think, in a way, I'm sorry this question is coming quite late because we've got less than 10 minutes, but Emma, I would ask, please, if you might feel able to just say a little bit about the land use partnership advice that we've given government, and whether we know what government plans to do with it now, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so since the that meeting, then the Land Commission has published its advice on the regional land use partnerships, and that's available on the website. Somebody will, Sarah or Jess will hopefully post up a link for you on that just a second. The regional land use partnerships, there is absolutely further work to be done on that, and to start with, that's going to be in the form of some pilot areas so that we better understand what they look like in practice, and what the implications are of regional land use partnerships. And they will be going forward in the next year or so. We're continuing to provide some support on those, but predominantly that work has now been handed over to the Scottish Government, who have formed a unit on regional land use partnerships to take that work forward.
Thanks, Emma. So to try, sorry about timing, but to respond, to try and deal with the question. So the advice is all published, and I do emphasize, because there was a misunderstanding at the NFU conference, that you know, what was published was the consequence of long discussions with NFUS and others, but it is just the beginning of something. And it is now the Scottish Government, NFUS are very closely involved in that. And I think NFUS staff were as surprised as anyone actually by some of the things that were said in the conference. So important just to be clear that it's not as was interpreted by some people. But there is no doubt that government would like to introduce the idea of regional land use partnerships, and it will be discussing with that people, and I suspect that things will progress probably after the election. We've put up a link to that on the way now, on the chat there. I think, I'm sorry if I've skipped over anything. I don't think so. I think we've probably covered everything that's in the chat. I'm trying to scroll through it. We've just got 5 minutes left, so I think I'm going to pull it to a close. Just before I do that, though, given we've just got a few minutes, Lorne, David, Emma, in that order, do you any just final quick thoughts you want to offer? Lorne first. Quick, I emphasize.
No, I don't think there's anything else to add that I haven't had the opportunity to talk about. Tax obviously is one that I'm heavily involved with at the moment, and community land ownership. But no, I don't think I've got anything else to add. Thanks. Really enjoyed the discussion.
Thanks, Lorne. David?
Well, I think it's been a very good evening because it's just demonstrated how broad and wide are land issues in Scotland. We've covered a huge amount of ground here. What's the Commission trying to do? I mean, our strapline from the start has been about making more of Scotland's land. And I think that applies right across the piece to everything that we've been talking about, of making more in terms of efficiency, but also making land more useful to the people of Scotland. And it's a hugely broad topic, so I'm not surprised that some of the stuff we've been able to, I think, to answer fairly thoroughly. some of it hopefully we'll get onto, or there is information on the Commission website if we haven't fully answered it tonight. Thank you.
Great, David. Thanks, David. And Emma, just the last thought from you.
Yeah, a couple of things I wanted to mention, just that there is support for community asset transfer processes. I don't think we've mentioned that through Development Trust Association Scotland and Community Land Scotland, so get in touch if those details would be helpful. Something we spend a fair bit of our time on in my team is casework, and that's where people come forward and they tell us that the protocols there are examples of the protocols not being very well followed by people, and you can get in touch if that's the case. I've got in touch with a few people on the chat this evening where I think that might be helpful, and then we can work with both parties to find a way through that and explain what our expectations are and so on. But generally, it's been a bit more of a technical question evening today, so that's been really interesting. But do get in touch if there's any other questions you have or anything you weren't happy to share this evening. It's really helpful for us to understand what things are actually like for different people in different parts of Scotland. So thanks for your time tonight.
Great, Emma, thank you very much indeed. So usually at a public meeting, the interesting bit starts now because we close the meeting and then people start asking me all the things that they didn't dare say in public, but which are actually really useful. So the first thing I want to say in closing is please feel free to contact us. I do quite often after these online public meetings end up phoning people because they've contacted us and having really useful conversations, and I will do that. I will commit to phone, or I may ask Lauren if it's a tax issue to phone, but we will contact you if you want. So there's an email address just been put up on the chat. Please use it if you want to contact us, and we'll find a way of doing a one-to-one, even if it's not in a village hall. The second thing to say is we have a really good and incredibly broad now website with masses of publications. There's enough there to take on holiday and read for weeks and weeks and weeks. And it's good stuff, actually. So please use the website. I'm really proud of it. And the third thing is to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to Jess and Sarah, who've organised this and kept the technology moving. Thank you very much to David and Lauren and Emma. But most importantly, thank you to so many people. We had over 40 people on the call at one point. Thank you all very, very much indeed. These conversations influence how we think, influence what we do, influence our plans, and so on and so forth. So they're very, very important to us, and I'm most grateful. No need to say safe journey, but thank you again, and hope to see you at another of these public meetings before very long. Good night, everybody. Thank you.